you a little bit about Machiel Salomons. He holds a master's degree in international law from the University of Amsterdam and pursued postgraduate studies in international human rights law at Oxford University. After an internship at the UN in New York, he began a career with the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs and then joined the evaluation service of the United Nations World Food Program in Rome. His first field assignment was in Hong Kong, where he joined the UNHCR as field officer during the height of the emergency influx of Vietnamese refugees in Southeast Asia. After various hardship positions in Africa and Asia, he returned to Europe in 2003 to become the deputy regional representative in Berlin, Germany, and representative in Romania, and United Nations Residence Coordinator in Romania. He then moved to Mozambique again as a representative, and since 2012, he's been the Principal Policy and Evaluation Officer in the Executive Office of the UNHCR. Some of the evaluation reports he's co-drafted include South Sudan, Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, Kenya, and refugee status determination procedures can be found that he's worked on the website. As you can see from the list of countries there, those are high receiving refugee countries. So we're very lucky to have him here. He's at the cutting edge of policy in terms of how the world is trying to respond to the refugee crisis in various parts of the world. And after seeing him in Newcastle, I can tell you that he's a dynamic speaker, and he has some very interesting insights to share with you tonight. So let's put our hands together.
Thank you so much, Gareth. Can anybody hear me with this microphone? I indeed had the true pleasure to meet Gareth. I was very, very impressed with his views, and actually I have stolen some of his views and ideas in subsequent speeches, so he's a great inspirator. I'm very honored and I'm very pleased to be here today, and in fact I'm going to take advantage of your presence, because working in the policy and evaluation service in the Office of the Commissioner, we are quite often asked to come with ideas and plans, and quite often we run out of ideas. And it's during lectures like this, when the question and answers are being posed and ideas are submitted, that all of a sudden new ideas pop up. So I encourage you to be totally open and totally frank and be provocative, and I will do the same thing during the Q&A. I also have to be realistic, and I also have to be a little bit careful. Why? Because I'm not speaking in my capacity as Machiel Salomons, I'm speaking in the capacity of representative of the High Commissioner for Refugees. And two of my colleagues recently got a little bit into trouble. The first one was talking about the situation in Myanmar when it came to the treatment of Rohingya refugees. And another one was pronouncing himself on the election of Donald Trump in Washington. So I don't want to get in trouble with you. I'm going to be coming with hopefully an interesting expose, but I'm going to be very honest and straightforward. I have to tell you that although our statute clearly says that we're non-political, we're probably the most politicized organization within the United Nations system after the Security Council, because we constantly have to make concessions and in order to help the refugees. So in my presentation today, I hope to give you a general background of what UNHCR is doing. Then I will present to you contemporary challenges, and I will also say a little bit about the EU-Turkey statement, which some of you may know doesn't carry a signature. So we're going to ask what the legal status is, what the public relation function of it is. And then afterwards, we're going to talk about the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants, which is a very, very unique attempt in order to address the current realities. What are the current realities? That migrants and refugees and asylum seekers, they're all mixed up. And the traditional approaches that we apply no longer function. So we have to address this. So with this New York Declaration, we hope that we will come up with a new regime in about 2 years. I will explain. This is, this is hot from the press. Nobody has seen this before. You're the first group that will get this presentation. And I also have to tell you, the issue of refugees is such a hot topic that for the first time in history, an American president chaired during the UN General Assembly a heads of state summit that was entirely devoted to the issue of migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. So hopefully by the end of this presentation, you know exactly what the difference is. Let's go to the next one. So what about the UNHCR's mandate? All right, UNHCR was set up in 1950, as you probably know, to address 30 million displaced people that emanated from the Second World War. UNHCR received a statute and we set up our office in the Palais des Nations in Geneva. Very interesting because we had only 30 staff and a budget of 30 million. And our first High Commissioner already said, look, how can we give protection to refugees if refugees are dying of hunger? And that's actually the first time that the international community agreed that our mandate would expand a little bit and that we would provide assistance to refugees. And to illustrate the statistics that I will present to you later on, you will note that we went from 30 staff members in 1950 to close to 15,000 today. And we went from a budget of 30 million to a budget of 8 billion. So we are now, after the Department of Peacekeeping Operation, probably in terms of staff and budget, the biggest. And this is a reflection of the current realities, because never before, since we were set up, were there so many persons of concern to UNHCR, 65 million. And the numbers are rising and rising every day as we speak. So, in those days, the 1951 Convention was also adopted, and that makes UNHCR unique in the international arena of the United Nations. Because the 1951 Convention, although it had two limitations, the geographical limitation, that means only pertaining to refugees emanating from Europe, and there was also a time limitation, only to refugees before 1950. So that was taken care of with the 1967 protocol. Both limitations were kind of lifted. But the unique thing about the 1951 Convention is that it has Article 35. Does anybody know what Article 35 says? Because that's how I can test your knowledge. Does anybody know what Article 35 is? Most people, when they hear and they think of the 1951 Convention, they think of Article 33, the non-refoulement principle, or Article 1, which I will describe in a minute. But few people realize that Article 35 is probably the most important provision. Why? Because every state that has ratified the 51 Convention recognizes the supervisory role of UNHCR and agrees to cooperate. And what difference does this make for UNHCR as compared to WFP or UNDP or UNICEF in the field? The big difference is that if a government is fed up of UNICEF or UNDP or any other UNHCR, they just simply kick them out. But the moment they try to do that with UNHCR, they violate international law. Because it is, as you probably know, it is an important source of international law, a treaty. And you know that the sources of international law are defined in Article 38 of the Statute of the International Court of Justice. Treaty is the most important one, but also customary law. So 1951 Convention, very, very important instrument. So we have the statute and the convention that gives us a very, very powerful tool. And we use this to exercise our protection mandate. But now, before continuing explaining what our protection mandate is, I have to explain to you what a refugee is, according to the 1951 Convention. Article 1A gives this definition. There are 155 words, and each word has been the subject of interpretation by a court. In fact, you could fill this entire room by judgments all over the world for each and every word. And I will go over some of the key words. And why is it so important? Because many people, politicians included, are mixing up migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees. And I hope that after this lecture you will never forget what a refugee is. Okay. Is anyone here outside the UK? Yeah? All right. So, what do you do if you lose your passport?
Go to the embassy.
Exactly. And what does the embassy go to do?
Check
Exactly. And by virtue of what ground do they have to do that? That's correct. And it's the actual ground in international law is diplomatic protection. They call that diplomatic protection. The state is obliged to provide that protection. A refugee can't go to his embassy because the embassy is a real extension of the very entities that were responsible for his or her persecution. And that's why the international community said, okay, fine, we need to have an international organization to ensure that a refugee gets at least a travel document and protection. But what are the criteria, what are the conditions that have to be fulfilled in order to be considered a refugee? First of all, you need to have a well-founded fear. Fear is subjective. And if you see a mouse in the kitchen and you run out of your house and you run out of your town and you cross the border, you may have a well-founded fear. It's not amounting to persecution, and therefore you're not going to get the status. The way protection works all over the world is that states, when they determine the status of a refugee, is they first and foremost look at the nationality. Where are they coming from? And if you come from Syria nowadays or North Korea, then basically there's well-founded fear and you probably are likely to get the status. But if you are from Switzerland, the chances that you get your status are very small, but not impossible. And I'll give you an example. There was a family in Germany that didn't want to expose their 5 children to the high school, things that had drugs, alcohol, they were very, very religious. So they decided to educate the children themselves at home. But in Germany, if you do that, you can be sentenced to jail for 3 years. So they fled and they went to the United States and they presented their claim and they got their refugee status. And they were claimed to be persecuted on religious grounds, and they were successful. That's one extreme, but it illustrates it. Well, that well-foundedness is very important. And then the second word that's so important is persecution. Persecution is something completely different from prosecution. Prosecution is a term in criminal law, I'm not going to elaborate, but persecution is something much more, some people would say subtle, but it can take different forms. It can take the form of discrimination, to arbitrary arrest, to detention, to torture, and to, actually being, executed. So you need to be persecuted, but you need to be persecuted on 5 grounds. The first one is race. If you're able to prove that you were persecuted on the basis of your racial origin, then you can get the state. And there are plenty of examples in history whereby people were successful in that claim because they were persecuted on racial grounds. The most obvious example is the apartheid regime. The second one is religion. There are many people who were persecuted because they were, having a certain faith in a certain country. I'm not going to elaborate on the country specifically because I don't want to get in trouble, but you can think of examples. Then there's the nationality. The good examples are, for instance, the situation in Kosovo before the war started and Kosovo became a sovereign state. Membership of a social group. That's a very important one. It's a new one because I want to give you another spectacular example. Women, for instance, can fall within that category. It happened in Guatemala that women were constantly beaten up by their husbands. And when they would go to the police said, "What are you doing?" They started off. They sent the wife back. And they were again beaten up. So there was a woman successful when going to present a claim that they were persecuted by the state because they were constantly beaten up. And there you have the word unable. If you're unable or unwilling to get the protection of your state, you can get your refugee status. She was successful in that one. And then the last one, the political opinion. And, before the fall of the Iron Curtain, if somebody would flee from Eastern Europe, from Russia, they would automatically be granted refugee status because the penalty for leaving the country illegally would be 10 years. So it was also part of the propaganda war. So if you meet those definitions and criteria, you would get a status. But this was, of course, in the 50s and in the 60s and in the 70s. But the times have changed. The times have changed in the sense that people are now fleeing, started to flee civil war. And stricto sensu, if you would flee a civil war, you would not automatically get your refugee status because the lawyers in the state determination process would argue, well, where's the individual persecution? And on what ground? Is it race, religion? The fact that bombs are falling on your roof or that forces you to leave, that's not a ground to get refugee status, legally speaking. But that, and this is a good example of what UNHCR is doing when it comes to protection. It's exactly what we have been trying to do for years, and that is to instill amongst governments, asylum countries, that getting refugee status doesn't depend on the individual persecution, but will surely also result as a because of a war, that you're fleeing a war. And that's not anchored in legislation. Another example of a unique case that I want to share with you was a case of a woman who was fleeing the Taliban. And the Taliban regime. She ended up in Germany when I was working there. And in those days, if you would be raped as a woman, or if your husband would die, you could end up being, executed yourself. So if ever someone was entitled to refugee status and protection, it was a woman who was fleeing the Taliban. So they came to Germany and they presented a claim. And the case went all the way to the Bundesverfassungsgericht, the highest judicial body. But they said, stricto sensu, a positive interpretation of the law says that in order to qualify for refugee status, you need to be persecuted by a recognized state. Since no state recognizes the Taliban, there's no persecution. Luckily for the lady in question, Germany has the so-called B status or de facto status, which allowed her to stay on humanitarian ground. But it is an illustration how the definition can be interpreted sometimes very rigidly and sometimes very lightly. And this is so important because if you look at the situation today, where you have this mixed movement of people, of migrants, asylum seekers, refugees, the state is increasingly getting concerned to allow people to enter a procedure that is not only costly, but takes a lot of time, and ultimately doesn't really lead to a decision, because if people are screened out and are determined not to be illegal in the next direction, sometimes they can't even go home. So, continuing with our activities. Humanitarian assistance, that's the second area. I explained to you. If you think of UNHCR, you will see you think of the tents, and you will see, hundreds of relief workers. Well, that is indeed the public image that we now have. But that's because 9 out of 10 refugees are not in the West, are not in the United States or in Europe, but they are actually in developing countries. And it's the poorest of the poorest countries that actually have to take care of them. When you're confronted with a refugee situation and the country can't take care of it, UNHCR steps in. And we literally take over. It's like running an entire village. We bring in tents, we bring in health, and we bring in services. We bring in NGOs, education, wash, you name it, we take care of it. It's also very painful because internally displaced people, they may be fleeing for the same reason as a refugee, but if they don't cross an international border, they are not automatically entitled to the same assistance and protection. When I worked in Guinea, in West Africa, I see that with my own eyes, that Liberian and Sierra Leone refugees on the side of Guinea received wonderful medical assistance by Médecins Sans Frontières. They received food, everything, children went to school. But on the other side, displaced people were dying simply because the respective governments didn't allow them. So there's now also a trend that says, how come this disparity? How come it's possible that if you're refugees, you enjoy so much protection and assistance, but if you're an IDP, when the causes are the same? So this is not a confusing element. Now the second role that we have to fulfill is to provide a durable solution for refugees and asylum seekers. An asylum seeker is, by the way, someone who's seeking a refugee status, but is not yet a refugee. A refugee is someone who can indeed claim to have been persecuted on any of the grounds that I enumerated. The idea is that a refugee shouldn't stay on that status forever. A refugee should, and this is what happening according to the 1981 Convention, but also here written, get the nationality. So that's integration. But refugees can also be returning home on a voluntary basis, which is for us the preferred solution. And since we were established, more than 55 million refugees have returned under our auspices. And the third one is resettlement. Resettlement is a buzzword that few people actually know what it really means. But if an asylum seeker or a refugee cannot stay in the asylum country, they are going to another country. And the United States takes in 50,000 every year. In Europe, it's only a meter, 2,500. Australia takes in 15,000. And I want to give you an example of the importance of resettlement. I once served in Malaysia, and there was a North Korean diplomat. This was so long ago that the guys were safe, but he was basically asking for asylum in Malaysia. But Malaysia had an extradition treaty with North Korea and hadn't ratified the 81 Convention. So they wanted to arrest him and send him back. So he went to UNHCR, and we put him on our compound where he stayed for 2 months. And we tried to negotiate his safe exit passage to Sweden. But meanwhile, our compound was surrounded by security officials, waiting to apprehend him the moment he would leave the compound. So we negotiated, and we got the Swedish authorities on board, and they issued already a temporary Swedish identity document, on the basis of which he was able to legally leave and then vanish. So this is an extreme example of what resettlement can entail. But it can also pertain to people who cannot get the proper medical treatment or for family reunion purposes. And so these are the three durable solutions. Another activity which is very important is our fight against status. Because if you're a stateless person, you can't get married, you can't register your child, you can't get a job, you can't even be buried. And we don't get involved the same way as with the refugees, instead in the sense that we would get individually involved, but we try to influence legislation. And the most spectacular example is perhaps when Czechoslovakia broke into 2 states. The Slovak Republic was about to adopt legislation that would overnight make 300,000 Roma stateless. So when we found out, we started to talk with the politicians, with the members of parliament, and we successfully managed to negotiate with them to change the legislation, resulting in 300,000 people actually getting or retaining their Slovak nationality. So this is another example of what our protection function is. You know, we are operational in 460 places in 126 countries, and questions often asked, so what do you do as a protection agency? What can you do? What are protection officers do? And I can see, when I look around, that there are many of you who may aspire to have a career with UNHCR. Well, this is a good time because we're recruiting. We're in fact the only agency that is recruiting like mad. We need people who are really committed. But the question is that you probably have, so what am I going to do then as a protection officer? What is my role? Well, that depends, my answer is, to the country where you're serving. If you're serving in, let's say, the developed world, your role can be literally standing between an army with guns and asylum seekers who are trying to cross the border, where you have to negotiate with the local police commander to keep the border open. Two, working in Western Europe, for instance, trying to influence legislation and even writing amicus curiae brief on behalf of asylum seekers and refugees. And to give you a good example, in the early 90s, when the United States was confronted with an influx of Haitian and Cuban boat people, the US started to intercept the boats and return them to the respective countries. And UNHCR hired the services of Professor Guy Guggengill, famous professor at Oxford University, who wrote one of the best amicus curiae briefs that I've ever read, in which he argued that intercepting at the high sea amounts to refoulement, because potentially there could be refugees. If you're interested in the ruling, you can find it on UNHCR's website. Anyway, to make a long story short, the Supreme Court rejected that. But this is another example where UNHCR exercised its protection function. Let me give you another role. We are also getting involved with the media. And we have public relations officers all over, but we have to be very careful. And here, the political aspects plays a role. And because what we saw in Europe in 2015, when 1 million displaced people traveled through Central Europe, I can assure you, panic broke out. There's a Professor Holstein, who wrote a book, International Relations, and he said that foreign policy is defined by primary, secondary, and tertiary foreign policy objectives. Well, if it is something that is not so important, it's the tertiary objective. But if it's really crucial, it becomes the primary foreign policy. And refugees, the whole refugee debate cascaded from the outer layer to the second layer to the first layer, culminating in the famous statement of Angela Merkel in September last year, when she said, "We are schaffen das." Remember, we will take care of these refugees. Well, in the Netherlands, where I come from, although refugees and asylum seekers didn't make it to the Netherlands, because most of them went to Germany or they went to the Nordics, by virtue of the media reports, there were censuses conducted, there were opinion polls that made, and 65% of the population who had never seen a refugee before or an asylum seeker before stated that the presence of asylum seekers and refugees in their country posed the most serious threat to their welfare, their culture, and their acquired rights. And in opinion polls, all of a sudden, you saw right-wing parties coming up in the polls and became more and more popular because they found a niche. So it is a very sensitive topic, and UNHCR in Europe, when it comes to protection, is much more diplomatic. They take a step back. And the 1951 Convention says, for instance, that every refugee has the right to property and belongings. So when Denmark, one of the biggest supporters of UNHCR, throughout the history of UNHCR, all of a sudden adopted legislation on the basis of which refugees with more than €5,000 had to surrender, maybe even there. UNHCR, of course, made a very quick statement that stayed out of the political debate because it didn't want to be drawn in the polemique, in the debate that was going to be left behind. So we have to be very careful. We speak behind the scenes. Let me tell you, there was footage where you saw Juncker and Angela Merkel and our High Commissioner, Mr. Guterres, who is now the Secretary General, all three. And they were giving press statements about the situation and how to handle the problems in Europe. And I can assure you, because I'm in the same cabinet as the High Commissioner, Angela Merkel was touched twice, 3 times per day on the phone with our High Commissioner. What about Greece? Can we agree to this? So this illustrates how sensitive. So let's continue with the last one. Provide reintegration to returnees. The returnees are of course, former refugees who go back there. But the situation in Syria, there's nothing left in most of the country. So if refugees, and I've been to the refugee camps in Lebanon and Turkey and Jordan, my reports are on the website, Lebanon and Jordan. Turkey I just finished. I wonder whether I ever see the daylight, but keep on hoping, and keep on, I will tell Gareth if it will be published so you can see. All these people have in common that they all want to go back to Syria. I've never seen a caseload of refugees who are more eager to go back. 4.2 million people. They live under terrible conditions. They all want to go back to Syria. But when they go back, there's nothing. There's just rubble. So the UNHCR has received a mandate by the General Assembly to also get involved with the proper integration of returnees. And that's also a unique role. And that role can take different forms. Now, let's look a little bit at the statistics. We have 65 million, not since the Second World War, where there were so many people displaced. And look, about 10 years ago, when Mr. Guterres assumed his role as High Commissioner, there were 10 million refugees. And I remember that we were in a discussion, and he said, look, maybe we should focus now on environmental refugees, because otherwise I can predict what will happen. Our funding will go down and maybe we evaporate. So we have to sustain our existence and also to make sure that the international community can benefit from our expertise acquired over the years. We have to look at other ways. And nowadays we have 21 million refugees. And why is that possible? How is that possible? Combination of factors, but the Arab Spring is probably the most important one, because as you can see here, Syria has produced 4.9 million. Now then there are still 2.7 Afghans, 1.1. If, let's say that the international community would send the armies to Syria, Afghanistan and Somalia in order to enforce peace and making conditions, then 53% of all the refugees could return, and that would have a dramatic impact not only on how much money is spent but also in the interest of peace. Now there are 10 million IDPs, and for those who can count, the difference are the internally displaced persons. I want you to know that the international community, and this is led by an initiative of DFID, the UK, has come with a kind of a solution to the approach to IDPs. The international community says, look, what we're going to be doing is we're going to create clusters. And every UN agency or NGO that has an expertise in a specific cluster will assume responsibility. So UNICEF obviously would assume the leadership of the cluster when it comes to children. UNHCR would take protection and shelter. World Food Program takes care of food. World Health Organization for the health, etc., etc. And it would also all be coordinated by OCHA. And they would receive all the money and then distribute. That's the idea. Now, UNHCR is very concerned about this. Why? Because the next thing that happens is that this is also going to be replicated to refugee situations. And there we have a problem because, since we have the mandate for refugees, the moment WFP stops distributing food, for instance, and gives the food to the local population, that's the end of the refugee food assistance. So we want to retain the leadership when it comes to refugees. But there are some powers. Luckily, with the election of the Secretary General, who was the former High Commissioner, I think that this issue will be resolved. So, every day, 33,000 people are forced to flee their country. And that is quite huge. If you bring all the displaced people into one country, it becomes the 23rd largest country in the overall, which probably has the lowest literacy rate, the worst medical conditions, the lowest enrollment in school. It would be a terrible, terrible. So we work in 128 countries, and Let's see what are the top hosting countries. Turkey, 2.5 million. Pakistan, Lebanon, look at this one. Lebanon has so many refugees, 1.1, that 1 in 4, 1 in 5 is a refugee. If you would translate that to the UK, and there are 60 million people probably in the UK, it would mean that 50 million, 1.5 million refugees would reside here. Think about it. And Lebanon, yet, is coping with it. It's extraordinary. Iran, close to 1 million, Ethiopia, and Jordan are the big refugee hosting. So in summary, what we try to do is we want to fight in the international community to keep borders open so that asylum is preserved. The word asylum you won't find in the 1951. And it's fascinating. Why only refugees? Why not the word asylum? Where does the word asylum come from? And how can it be enforced? Well, it's a too long story to explain at this point in time. But it is part of the Declaration of Human Rights and Article 14. And it is upheld, to my big surprise, I have to say, because only a few countries in the world are denying access to the territory. And I have to say I'm very proud to work for UNHCR because I'm convinced that if UNHCR wouldn't exist, the whole notion of asylum would stop to exist. Protection of refugees would be granted, wouldn't exist. So, that's 456 locations. That means that if you work for UNHCR, by the way, you have to be prepared. You have to be extraordinarily flexible because one moment you're dealing with a very sophisticated government, let's say in London or in Berlin or in Paris, where you really need to have a very sharp legal mind or a very good political sensitivity. You need to be good in public relations and advocacy. The next moment you can be in Dire Dawa. Does anybody know where Dire Dawa is? Dire Dawa is a very small town in Ethiopia. It's in the middle of nowhere, you know? And if you work there, you have to eat what the refugees eat, and you have to live what the refugees, how the refugees live. So it's a very difficult work environment. I also want you to know that people who work in Baghdad or in Syria, they work in a container and they sleep in another container. So they have 150 meters to cross in a green zone, and that's their life. So it is also psychologically very, very stressful. You're also exposed to the most serious human rights violation imaginable. I once, when I served in Germany, I told you, I heard a knock on the door. And I was distracted, because I was writing. And I'm a lawyer, so I always wrote. So I was distracted and I said, come in. And the door didn't open. So the knock was louder. So I said, come in! So when the third time the knock was on the door, I walked to the door and I was about to strangle the person who distracted me. But when I opened the door, I saw something that I will never forget in my life. I saw a man, both his hands were headlocked. And he had a bandage and the blood was still coming out. Because that was the practice of the RUF in Sierra Leone, where they drugged children and they forced the children literally to hack off the hands of the entire villages. So I started to document. I hired MSF, I hired lawyers in order to, because I knew that one day would be an international criminal court to prosecute the perpetrators of these serious crimes. And they sent in a social worker, a counselor, to talk to me. And they said, how do you cope? How do you handle this? And I said, well, throughout my career, I've been confronted with serious human rights violations. Somehow or another, I have the ability to switch off after I get out of work. Otherwise I can't survive. I guess most of my colleagues are the same way. But then the counselor said, don't kid yourself for a moment. Because when you're older, it will haunt you and it will come back to you. And the evidence was found when I was invited to give a guest lecture at Oxford University in 1999. I was asked to talk about these atrocities that were committed. And on the front row was the retired director of international protection. And when I was telling the same thing that I'm telling you right now, he was holding his hands on his ears. And afterwards I went up to him and said, Professor Jaeger, why did you do that? It was very distracting. He said, my brain is like a hard disk and it's full. I can't absorb it anymore because I have sleepless nights. So I hope it doesn't happen. So this is the exposure that you get when you work. But on the other hand, it needs to be said that working for refugees, because these people whose limbs were hacked off, I was able to organize a resettlement program in the United States. And most of them now are completely integrated. They have a normal, quote-unquote, life. And nothing is more rewarding than to stand up for refugees and help them this way. If you're working in Geneva like I do, the policy, everything is abstract. But if you work down there in the field, you have that opportunity. Now, let's look a little bit at the funding, because what needs to be said is that we have a budget of 7 billion. It's unbelievable. Probably it's getting more. Where's most of the money going to? Still Africa, but the Middle East is the second largest we see. And then we have Asia Pacific, we have the Americas and Europe. Europe went up dramatically, which is, by the way, completely, in my view, ridiculous. Why should we deploy 150 staff members in Greece? 200 staff members are working there. When that money can better be used in, well, it's politics again, because the European Union is very concerned that people, that there are people move onward, so they have reinforced our presence there. Now, who are the biggest donors? The United States picks up 1/3 of our budget, year after year. And the question is, of course, on everybody's mind, will that contribution be sustained with the result of the latest election? Yeah? The Secretary General held a meeting with all the heads of agencies. They meet 2 or 3 times a year. It's like the G20 summit, but then for the agency, and on the basis of which an analysis was made of the impact of the elections. And sure enough, trade was going to be affected, environment could be affected, and probably immigration. So it is not entirely sure how it will translate in our funding, because you see, let me tell you something very interesting. When the war in Syria started and the outflux occurred, and everybody was there in Lebanon and in Jordan, there was a dramatic contribution by the international community that helped us sustain them over there to Turkey. But slowly, the contributions were smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, and we warned the international community, look, no refugee will stay in their asylum country if their children are not educated, if they can't feed their children, their families, or if there's no roof over it. They move on. That's our experience. And sure enough, people started to move. And that's how they ended up in Europe. And that's why this New York Declaration, and I hope, because I'm talking too much, I can already see, that's why the New York Declaration is so important. So it could very well be that the new administration that is not too favorable when it comes to immigration questions can say, well, maybe we should continue to support UNHCR, because at least the refugees will stay where they are, they won't be. So what are the 5 most important contemporary challenges that the UNHCR is facing? First of all, there's this unprecedented level of displacement. I explained it already earlier, the Arab Spring, but also related to that is fragile and failed states. If you think of a fragile and failed state, you immediately think of Afghanistan. where obviously, I don't know the details of what happened there. Somalia is another example. But few people may realize that at this point in time, Libya is a complete failed state where the government only extends 5 kilometers outside the capital. Otherwise, there are fiefdoms, there are clans, and in an environment like that, it's the perfect place for extremist groups to emerge that will subsequently organize terrorist attacks and also produce refugees. Then there's the changing nature of the conflict. I didn't bring that chart with me, but at least in a slideshow, I just want to show that to you because the Institute of Polymology in the Netherlands made an analysis of the nature of warfare. Here it is. Okay, so you can't see it, but the number of bilateral wars, so whereby two sovereign states were fighting each other with guns and artillery, that stopped already some 15 years ago. But the flavor, this is by the way 2006, but if it would be 2014, it would be here. This is the intrastate war, or the internationalized intrastate war. In other words, it's not just a civil war, but it's where one or more parties are assisted by outside forces, sovereign states. Now, the changing nature of the conflict results in massive displacement. And there is not a simple solution. I mean, regularly, I talked to the ambassador who was in the Friends of Syria, who told me a little bit about what's happening there in Syria. And it's just amazing. You have a Russian general that flies in every week to brief the ambassadors on the latest situation. And you will recall that the Americans were bombing a barrack where 85 Syrian troops died and 200 people were injured. And the Russians immediately afterwards started to attack this convoy, this relief convoy, whereby 18 trucks were destroyed. It's kind of a power sign. So that's an internationalized intrastate war. And that's actually the flavor of the month. Military experts, but also relief workers and planners have to address this in their longer term analysis. So it's not so easy to bring an end to a civil war or a conflict that can go on for generations. There are demographic increases and there's urbanization. And again, a spectacular example in Conakry, people are so poor, there's no prospect for employment. People are so desperate to leave the country that they climb over the fence, the airport, in order to hide in the hull of the plane, not knowing that the wheel will collapse and that they are up there in 56 degrees. Under minus 56 degrees, or they all freeze. So desperate are people to leave. And unfortunately, we've conducted studies, in the poorest of the poorest villages, you have these unscrupulous smugglers that extract money. The whole village gets together and gives $3,000. And they're put in a car to travel through the Sahara Desert. Well, I've been in the Sahara Desert. You cannot imagine how huge the Sahara Desert is. I tried to walk in the Sahara Desert in the sand, but after 50 meters I almost collapsed. So they get in a car, and quite often these cars run out of petrol and people are dying. We have no idea how many people have died there because we don't know how many people have left. And the people who have left the village, they don't know whether they made it in Europe. So that's the first obstacle. It's that sheer desire to go to Europe that makes these smugglers extremely rich. Then they get to Libya. In Libya, it's lawless or something. It's terrible what happens there. People are exploited, they're sexually abused, they are sometimes put as slave laborers. Once they make it, they are put on boats, and 3,500 people have already died this year. They have no idea how many people have died so far. It's a terrible situation. Who are these people? They are, probably migrants. And the difference between migrant and a refugee is that the migrant has a choice. A refugee doesn't have a choice, right? A refugee has to leave because if he stays, he will die, he will be persecuted. A migrant has a choice. And they are told by the smugglers, look, if you speak Arabic, then you're from Syria, you know? And if you are not an Arabic speaker, then pretend that you're from Eritrea. Because if you're from Eritrea and Syria, I talked about well-founded fear, states hold lists of safe countries, but also dangerous, then you have a fair chance to get to the state. So they abuse the asylum channel that abuse the state. Now climate change and the access to natural resources, in a way, mankind is responsible for global warming as a result of which the ice caps are melting and certain islands are inundated. Now, what do we do with the people? 300,000. We go to Tanzania and say, can these people please be moving here? These problems are not even tackled anymore by the international community because we're so preoccupied with the other forces. So these are the contemporary challenges, and unfortunately, you know, politicians and experts predict that things are only getting worse in the times to come. So, you know, your generation may not be as blessed as my generation was when it comes to peace and security. So be prepared. All that, and then I'm gonna, you know, I don't have a lot of time left, and that's why I have to really wrap it up. And, you know, the fact of the matter is, and I'm gonna limit myself only to this slide. It's interesting because I want to have this dialogue with you. I want to have provocative questions, and I want to have ideas. But you see, the experts in refugee law, Alexander Betts, who apparently spoke here, is one of them, and UNHCR, protection and policy staff, they were figuring, look, maybe we have to have a comprehensive overhaul in the way we do business. What we should do is address this in a global, not in an isolated way. What we have to do is to, when a developed nation is all of a sudden confronted with an influx of refugees, the first thing we're going to do is not only look at the well-being of the refugees, but also of the local population. So if when I was in Zambia, there was an influx of refugees from Angola, a hospital built in Nampula, and funded by development money. So why not, you know, work with World Bank, UNDP, and see to what extent the hospital cannot be expanded and also benefit the refugees. Another thing that we're now doing as a result of this, the New York Declaration, is rather than buying relief items in Denmark or in Saudi Arabia and then ship it, no, we give refugees, based on accurate registration, a credit card that they can use, or a debit card, and then they can buy it locally, and it will benefit the local economy. So, we also want to make sure that under no circumstances refugees, their rights are going to be compromised. But since refugees, the notion of refugee and migrants are very difficult to disentangle, we probably need to have a regime in place to also protect migrants. If you are outside Europe and you want to legally migrate to Europe, it's practically impossible. So that's why people are using the asylum channel, and thereby eroding probably what has been acquired over 60, 70 years. So it is recognized that states somehow or another have to set up a migration channel. So robust support, we need to have money, and the international community, after the New York Declaration, said, look, the $7 or $8 billion that you have is a lot, and you have reached your separation point, UNHCR. You can't handle it. So we're not going to give the money to the World Bank. And the World Bank is becoming so big and so important now that it is really, and they hire experts, and they're getting more and more involved in displacement questions. And the whole idea of the New York Declaration was, by the way, that everything would be wrapped up in New York by all the heads of state. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. So the idea was that there would be a global compact of refugees, over a period of 2 years, states would work together that would culminate in, let's say, the adoption of a declaration or even an international treaty that would ensure that refugees would require the right protection, that host communities would require the right support, that migrants would get the proper protection, and that donors would come up with predictable contributions. And the example that is often given is the situation in Uganda. Uganda confronted with a huge influx of refugees from various countries, not just South Sudan. And that country is not only adopting legislation that allows refugees to work, which is very important, but also it allows the refugees to be free. So, I see Garrett standing up. I'll stop here with my presentation and now I open the floor. Thank you very much.